Welcome back, everyone. Much like my last video, we're going to spend our time with White Wolf. Instead of their history, we're going to go through some of the many controversies the company weathered before ultimately being dissolved in 2018. As I briefly touched on in the last video, White Wolf was a true child of the 90s and thrived on pushing boundaries, a double-edged sword that would carve their name in RPG history, but also cut them down as sensibilities changed. Let's start strong. 2 years after the release of Vampire the Masquerade 2nd Edition, White Wolf would release World of Darkness, Gypsies, towards the end of 1994. Now, in the 90s, I don't think many people knew that Gypsy was often considered a slur by the Roma people, but that's probably something you should check before putting it in your book's title. This early warning sign would point towards a lack of research that would become apparent quickly as you flip through the pages. The book's intent was to expand the lore of one of the core 13 vampire clans, the Ravnos, a group of kindred who almost exclusively recruit from the Romani, a nomadic group that originated out of northern India. The text quickly explains that the Romani people are different from ordinary humans. They are born with special blood, a blood that inherently gives them magical powers and knowledge of the world of darkness, though at a cost. Their racial prowess causes them to be persecuted, as each member of the Romani gives off an inherent strangeness to an ordinary human that causes distrust. The book also explains that many Romani become petty criminals because they don't see stealing from normal humans as bad. The text eventually gives us some examples of how one could create a Romani character, emphasizing that the characters could have unique skills such as swindling, drinking, and mystical knife fighting. Wow! I feel like the original White Wolf brainstorm for this went something like, okay boys, what do we know about gypsies? They steal. Great. Oh, they tell fortunes. They sure do. And boy, do they like to fight. We're firing on all cylinders today, boys. Get it to the presses. Now, something like this would be excusable if it was your typical D&D fantasy race. But you have to remember, we're talking about a real group of people here. One has been genocided for stereotypes exactly like how White Wolf is now portraying them. Let's circle back to the Ravnos, the vampires of the Roma. While the Ravnos are also loaded with the stereotypes, their clan bane is off the rails. Every single Ravnos, cursed by the Romani blood, is inherently a criminal. They have to pass a willpower check to not commit crimes out of compulsion. How on earth White Wolf thought this was a good idea, I will never know. This wasn't even something that they addressed quickly. The Ravnos would continue to have this bane until 20th edition, which was released in 2011. For nearly 20 years, and well throughout the peak of the game's popularity, players were forced to contend with this stereotypical mess. Credit to the WoD community though, I will say that even in 1994, the community pushed back really hard on this book. It's probably a standout entry as one of the worst things they've ever done. For our next entry, White Wolf does a 180 and creates what might be one of the greatest RPG books ever written, Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah, a Wraith sourcebook that sets out to tell the atrocities of the Holocaust and the effects of such enormous death on the underworld. White Wolf put out all the stops with this one. They brought in Janet Berliner, a Bram Stoker-winning author, to consult on the book, along with a number of Holocaust survivors to oversee that they told the story with the reverence and historical accuracy it required. The book was released to immediate controversy, with critics on both sides praising it as either one of the best RPG books written or trash that tries to gamify the Holocaust. Personally, it's one of my favorite books White Wolf has ever written, and had they done this level of research on all of their books, this video would probably be a lot shorter. I highly recommend you check out Charnel Houses and really give it a solid read through. I'm not sure mechanically it's a great game, but it is an incredibly well thought out and thoughtful piece of literature that serves to ground the World of Darkness, and shows a level of maturity never seen before or again at White Wolf. Since we're on the topic of World War II, in 1993 we would be graced by the city sourcebook Berlin by Night, meant to give a greater depth and context to the city throughout the ages, especially during World War II. Much of the story follows the life and rule of longtime Prince Gustav, who saw his influence in Germany waning as we approached the Second World War. How would Prince Gustav reclaim influence? Through Adolf Hitler, of course. Gustav would first school high-ranking Nazi Heinrich Himmler. Gustav eventually reaches Hitler through Himmler, but is unable to dominate him due to his immense strength of will. Eventually, Himmler becomes a Tremere, who reveals that he is actually unbondable. Himmler goes on to form an anarch group called the Final Reich, set on restarting the Third Reich while hunting down Hermann Göring, who knows the location of the secretly alive Hitler, who has more or less become a magical girl, and absconded with the magic of Germany. The main controversy around this book was the inclusion of very real, very evil Nazi leaders, and simply saying that they were influenced by or are some kind of supernatural being. It takes away some of the responsibility of their actions when, even fictionally, you attribute them to the supernatural. While it is on the lesser side of most of these controversies, it's important to mention because had White Wolf learned their lesson the first time, they probably wouldn't have made the mistake that ultimately led to their downfall. Prepare yourself for what comes next, because it very well may be the worst thing White Wolf has ever released. An erotica book called Eternal Hearts, written by Lucy Taylor, an American horror novelist who was coming off of winning her first Bram Stoker Award. What she and White Wolf have put out is one of the grossest things I've ever had the misfortune of reading. The idea was to explore the idea of the vampire as a sexual metaphor for one who takes without consent. Not a bad thought, it handled it in a different context. It could have very likely been an excellent piece of literature. What we got instead was an erotica novel filled with necrophilia, lots and lots of graphic incest, rape, and dreadfully little plot. Check out this fun quote. It should tell you everything you need to know about Eternal Hearts. I'll put a link to the wiki page about it. Go ahead and Control-F the word rape, and watch it appear in almost every paragraph of the plot summary. I'm not sure what was going on with Miss Taylor at the time, but I hope she's doing better now. The sole redeeming quality of this book is that from an objective standpoint, it is well written, especially for the genre. It's clear Lucy Taylor is a talented writer. Unfortunately, it fails to ever stop being disgusting long enough for that to truly lead anywhere. It isn't art house, it isn't body horror like Freak Legion or the Bali Clan book. It's just flat out gross. Why is all I have to say about this book. Ready for a bit of a palate cleanser? Our next controversy is just good old-fashioned nerd drama, or the legal battle between White Wolf and their largest fan club. Throughout the 90s, the primary fan club for the World of Darkness would operate under the name the Camarilla Fan Club, named after the sect from Vampire. Originally formed as a non-profit group, the Camarilla would sign an agreement with White Wolf to become the official fan club of the game. This would continue for a few years until the original founders would dissolve the club, citing lack of time to continue devoting to the effort. In 1995, the Camarilla Club would reform under new leaders who never quite obtained official fan club status from White Wolf, though operated under the assumption that the prior agreement still stood. The Camarilla Club grew throughout the mid to late 90s, forming chapters across the world. As the club's membership grew, the directors of the fan club grew bold. In 1998, the fan club would file a U.S. trademark registration for the Camarilla name. Originally, White Wolf did not object, under the pretense that an official agreement would be worked out with the club. In 2000, the Camarilla fan club would receive the trademark officially, with White Wolf attempting to still negotiate. Now, 4 years into negotiations, White Wolf had had enough. White Wolf president Mike Tinney would forward an email to the Camarilla leadership from White Wolf's legal counsel, announcing that the company would be reclaiming the Camarilla name and assuming control of the club. The following day, the Camarilla fan club would file suit against White Wolf in federal court in the District of Utah. Around 10 days later, the judge would place a restraining order against White Wolf, forbidding them from officially assuming the control of the Camarilla club. White Wolf would then countersue in Georgia, their operating state. Obviously, when the case appeared before the Georgia court, it became patently clear that White Wolf was the creator and owner of the term Camarilla in this context. The Camarilla fan club directors would step down and eventually be replaced by White Wolf-appointed volunteers. The club has since been re-established, first in 2011 at the launch of V20 as the Mind's Eye Society, and again in 2020 as the Modern Enigma Society. I often see fans give White Wolf flack for this online, but I honestly can't fathom that the Camarilla Club really thought that they had an ounce of standing when it came to claiming the term Camarilla. In fact, I think White Wolf was actually quite generous here. Back to bad books. Up next is Kindred of the East. This is a book that has become more and more controversial as time has gone on, after initially reviewing quite well upon release. The controversy being the complete lack of understanding that White Wolf possessed about Asian culture in the 90s. The game essentially smashes the entire Asian continent into one weird, mystical monoculture that is super deep and super spiritual. The book centers around the Kuei Jin, a mishmash Chinese-Japanese word that roughly means ghost person. One of the first mistakes White Wolf made was attaching this directly to Vampire the Masquerade, instead of making the Kuei Jin their own splat entirely. I often see people online calling this book racist, but I don't really feel that it is. To me, it feels like a prime example of Orientalism. It is a view of Asia that is entirely make-believe and seen through the lens of a rather sheltered Western author, who means well but ultimately has no idea what they're writing. Besides shoving all of Asia into one group, the book seemingly infers that Asians have different souls from the rest of the world, that their spirits are destined to a different set of gods, the Yama Kings, hence being able to become a hungry ghost. Kuei Jin are called the Kindred of the East, but have almost nothing to do with the vampirism of their Western kin. They are instead hungry ghosts, which inhabit their old bodies, or occasionally the bodies of others. Really, they're more wraith than vampire. These monsters cannibalize their victims instead of drinking their blood, nor can they reproduce via the embrace. Kuei Jin more or less just happen, but only to Asians. An unfortunate side effect of this is that we basically got no other information on Kindred within Asia outside of passing mentions in the clan book La Sombra. This, of course, excludes the Ravnos, who White Wolf probably didn't consider as Asian. While the lore is a bit cringe, The real crime and controversy of this book lies within its mechanics. The Kuei Jin are stupendously overpowered, and for no reason other than Asia cool. Kindred of the East feels like a game designed by your weebiest friend, more concerned with how epic he can make his ghost katana sound than how it will actually play out on your table. Kuei Jin end up feeling more like a shonen protagonist than something out of a supposedly grimdark personal horror. The Kuei Jin have since been written out of the lore, retconned entirely. I hold it in my mind that the Kuei Jin were a problem of execution and not exactly concept. Had White Wolf consulted with actual Asians and scholars of the region like it did with Charnel houses, the idea could very well yet be saved. Our next controversy is a two-parter, involving both a published book and its author. I present to you Beast the Primordial. The gist of this game is that you take control of a beast from myth and are pursued by a hero destined to slay you. Think of yourself as Grendel and the hero as Beowulf. As a beast, you feed off the suffering of humans, your wicked deeds eventually creating the hero that will come after you. The text, however, often describes the heroes as irrationally obsessed and goes to great lengths to denigrate them or show them in a poor light, while constantly making excuses for the outright selfish and evil acts of Beast. For some reason, the author also felt the need to explicitly compare being born as a beast to being born as a member of the LGBTQ. Yeah, they're both persecuted. One of them, however, perhaps, is justified. As you read through the book, it becomes more and more obvious that the author is writing abusers as sympathetic, while doing everything he can to make the victims appear as rational or crazy. I've seen it described as feeling like it was written from the mind of a child molester. Imagine the surprise when it turns out the author actually was one. Shortly after the release of Beast, author Matt McFarland would be accused of sexually assaulting a teenage girl at a convention decades ago. McFarland would admit to this and apologize through his blog. Following this, several more women would come forward and accuse him of assaulting them throughout the years. After this, it would become apparent that his wife, Michelle, a longtime White Wolf staffer, had known about the accusations and had been using her position to cover for him for years now. It took about a nanosecond for fans of White Wolf to start connecting the dots between the underlying themes of Beast and the very real beast that wrote them. Both Matt and his wife Michelle would be immediately fired from both Onyx Path Publishing and White Wolf, both being removed from their moderator positions at RPG.net and slinking back into the shadows instead of the jail cells they rightfully belong in. To conclude our Drama Fest, I'm going to touch back on the release of the V5 Camarilla book, which would lead to the dissolution of White Wolf Games. While I covered it briefly in my previous video, we're going to go into deeper detail this time that adds some much-needed context. To briefly reiterate, in the Camarilla sourcebook for the 5th edition of Vampire, a sidebar was included that referenced the very real persecution of homosexuals in Chechnya. Here's a picture of the passage as it was presented to the public. In it is presented in the third person, and seems to be a universal statement that vampires are merely using this very real event to distract from their machinations in Chechnya, that homosexuality is viewed as wrong in Kindred society, and that the torture of homosexuals in the region is not only okay, but beneficial to Kindred in the region. Now, the original intent of this passage was to show a conversation between a low humanity Banu Hakim and a high humanity, progressive Bruja, who laments being unable to help those who are being persecuted. Likely to save page space, the Bruja's portion of this conversation was cut, and we only received the seemingly universal view of the quite detached Asimite. With this additional context, the passage becomes much more tolerable, and it boggles the mind a bit as to why the final edit landed this way. Needless to say, the fanbase and media backlash was immense, and White Wolf was dissolved. However, our story does not end quite there. If you're familiar with the book or my previous video, you would know that the source book also claimed that Ramzan Kadyrov, very real and very much alive head of the Chechen Republic, was actually a ghoul, subservient to his kindred masters. Upon hearing this, the Russian government got involved, forcing apologies from local translators of the book with the threat of jail time and threatening to bar Paradox from operating within Russia if they did not immediately recall the book, which of course they did. Somewhat ironically, a lot of good did come out of this. Multiple publications put out articles highlighting the fact that Kadyrov was operating death camps, and many LGBTQ charities received a sizable bump in donations from gamers. Russia's attempt to bury the story led to the Streisand effect, which they greatly amplified a controversy that would have stayed in the niche TTRPG space and put it in the forefront of the weekly news cycle. Now that's most of our major controversies, so let's quickly hit some honorable mentions. Up first, portrayal of trans characters. This is something that has greatly improved over time, but for a very good chunk of White Wolf's existence, every trans character was more or less an extremely deviant pervert whose gender identity only really served to further their perversions. As an excellent segue, we can talk about Dr. Totentans, White Wolf's trans Dr. Mengele. This picture alone should say enough. One book that didn't make the cut was the 2017 Werewolf book Changing Ways. Changing Ways featured an aside on trans Garu. declaring them an affront to Gaia and making references to werewolves self-castrating with silver. The book also featured paragraphs that supported anti-abortion, anti-vaccination, and racial purity messages. This was allegedly forced into the book by Paradox. Jason Carl has sincerely apologized for the inclusion since. Our final honorable mention goes to Werewolf yet again, and the Swords of Heimdall. The Swords of Heimdall were a neo-Nazi offshoot of the Get of Fenris. I've seen many point to them as a black mark against Werewolf, but many neglect to follow that up with the fact that the Get hunted them to extinction. Ferociously meritocratic, the Get would never suffer Garu who claimed superiority on their race alone. Lineage might be a different story though. If you made it all the way here, thank you for hanging with me. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe. I am certain that I missed some controversy along the way. Let me know in the comments below so we can all come together and bond over the goofiness that was White Wolf Games. Thanks again.